Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Mather. I'm an applied data scientist here at Civis, and today I'm going to be talking about understanding your donors with a 360-degree view. And in particular, here at Civis, we call that data unification and identity resolution. I've also brought my co-presenter, Marty, so you can get a brief view and, ingratiate myself before we jump in. So I'll let him go. So just a brief agenda for today. First, I'm going to talk about the problem, what identity resolution is, and how to know whether you need it. Then talk through the problems that IDRes, IDR, identity resolution, all the same thing, does solve. Briefly mention some problems that identity resolution doesn't solve. And then finally, some things to consider if you are in a position of evaluating different ID resolutions. Cool, so you may be wondering to yourself, like, what is identity resolution? And to really understand that, you kind of have to back up and understand what the problem that it solves is. So the first thing is, if you are in a position at your organization where you have multiple different sources coming in to a single database, for instance, a CRM like Salesforce or Van, your email system like ActionKit, and an SMS or texting system like Mobile Commons, you are seeing all of those data sources in kind of their own separate thing, and they have no common ID to kind of join them together and figure out which records are the same. So you might be in a position to use, to make good use of IDR. And specifically, if you're using data from all of these different systems in your reporting and analytics existing infrastructure. And another thing you might want is to be able to append third-party data into your existing source system data. And finally, it's going to kind of give you a single source of truth for all of your PII or information that, and particularly that can change over time at the person level. So think like addresses, emails, even names like that can change for your donors probably. So, when I was first learning about IDR, it kind of seems like a trivial problem. Like, okay, I have all these different sources, but if I care about kind of matching them together and figuring out who is the same person, can I just like match them by names, which is one approach. But the short answer is no, I would not do that. You can do it, but it's gonna create a lot more problems than it solves. Kind of at a technical level, it's a lot of logic just to kind of take your existing data and say, this person in Salesforce is this person in Mobile Commons. You kind of have to map out a lot of business rules. And then, like I talked about before, that information can actually change over time. So identity resolution at a super high level solves these problems by implementing some logic and business rules to map out what makes sense for choosing that PII, but under the hood, it's going to do some probabilistic matching to say, who we're pretty confident is the same person. And like I mentioned before, IDR is going to allow you to have a single source of truth about your donors, and it promotes data hygiene. Ultimately, like organizations I've worked with that have IDR, it's a lot quicker to really jump into a project when you can say, okay, I have all these disparate source systems, but for the purposes of reporting and analytics, this is my single table that I care about and all of the records within that. At Civis, we like to call it a golden table, where you have, a single row for each of your donors, and you can say, this is this person in Salesforce, and this person in Mobile Commons, or something like that. So kind of to map this out conceptually, it's going to look something like this. So you can see this is a slightly commercial example, but you would have 3 different source systems: your email database, your customer database, and a loyalty program. From within that, you can see that in the email database you have an inactive email, but for that same person, you have a current email in your loyalty program. So bringing all of that together, you can get a single record for that one individual. At a technical level, that means that we're going to assign a master unique ID across sources, and this allows you to build a profile of each individual in your universe, and finally to take the most up-to-date and reliable PII from each source. So I'm going to dig into each of these a little bit more, but at a high level, the problems that identity resolution does solve is, first off, like I've mentioned, giving you a 360-degree view of your donors. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And slightly different, but giving you a cross-system view of your members and donors for analytics and reporting. Like I've mentioned, a consolidated source system for PII, especially that can change over time. And finally, it does allow you to append data from third-party systems by being able to say, if you're in a position of using like voter data, you can match that and bring those columns into any analytics or reporting you're using. One theme you may be gathering from today is that often it's really about using the right tool for the job. So I wanted to call out that there are some problems that IDRes doesn't solve. And can't solve and shouldn't solve. So in particular, IDRes is not a replacement for a CRM. It should work in conjunction with an existing CRM, but it's not really a good place to track donors in like a production system. And you can export resolved information back to source systems. So say you want to export back that most recent email into your Salesforce instance, that's something you can certainly do. Though I don't recommend that as like its primary use case. Typically, it would be a lot of lift for something like that, and there are probably better tools. And finally, identity resolution should work in conjunction with an existing set of tools and reporting structure. So to get the most out of it, you will likely have technical people already on your team to kind of use and maintain it. I want to emphasize that it is a technical solution to a technical problem. So although it can solve a lot of other problems down the pipeline, it should kind of sit within a existing analytics and reporting structure. Cool. So I've mentioned this phrase, giving you a 360-degree view of your donors. So what does that mean? What that really means is that if you are in a position of having, a bunch of different source systems that are all giving you individual level data, you can have cases in which, there are the same individuals who have multiple records in each system. So that can be really confusing because, Animather in Salesforce and Animather1 in Salesforce could be the same person with the same email. But if you don't have a process to say that, you're kind of not getting accurate information out of that. On the other side of that, you can have the same person who has multiple records in different systems. So I could exist both in your Salesforce database and in your Mobile Commons database. And without some sort of IDR structure, you're not going to have a way of saying Animather in Salesforce is Animather in Mobile Commons and grabbing that relevant PII from each. And I've talked about this a little bit already, but being able to resolve your first party records to IDs from third-party systems. So again, if you have voter information where you want to say Animather in Salesforce is Animather on the voter rolls, you can put that into your system if that's data that you have access to. So getting a little bit more into that cross-system view. So that's going to allow you, I've kind of gotten at this a little bit, but you're going to have a lot more reliable counts for just like even the number of donors in your system or your number of supporters. If you are not able to resolve people across systems, you really have no way of saying that. Another kind of more subtle thing that it's going to allow you to do is use different attributes from different data systems to kind of like make different definitions. So say you want a count of your members, and that membership definition can have, come from Salesforce or from ActionKit. They have made a donation and it's tracked in Salesforce, or they have subscribed to a newsletter. In that way, you can, accommodate both of those definitions as a single attribute and get a final count. And then to reemphasize, this is going to be your single source of truth for your person-level data, and is going to give you like a really nice, easy to use clean table output. And then finally, so once you have your cross-system identifier, you're able to select the most reliable and up-to-date PII from each source system. So like we've talked about, that can be names, addresses, emails, anything that's going to be that you can match back to a person and it's going to change over time. Civis does have a solution for this, and one of the outputs is just a single, again, golden table for grabbing that most reliable PII. And then I talked about before, if exporting like updated email addresses back to your CRM is something that would be valuable to you, that is something that can be backed by an IDR solution. And I've talked a little bit about this, but appending third-party data is another thing that an IDR solution is going to allow you to do. So you have your source systems already, but you'd like to match on another person-level piece of information that can give you more like modeled information, gendered information, or gender, race. Sometimes if you've like bought PII from a vendor, that is all something that's going to be much easier to match on once you have that common ID. And it's going to take your tech team a lot less time to do it. So the final thing I want to talk about is if this all sounds really interesting to you and you're kind of thinking about like, man, I could use an ID res solution. Here are the things that I would think about. Identity resolution, like I've talked about, is ultimately a technical solution to a technical problem. It's going to live on a database. So it should live within your existing reporting and analytics database. And it will also likely require maintenance and kind of just general understanding by a technical person within your organization to get the most out of it. So to give you a sense of what this looks like for a Civis platform client, if they want to get a count of their donors that's up to date, we can set up a process that looks to the most recent ID res output. So that's going to run weekly, take in all of their source system data, and spit out a count to, it can be a Google Sheet or a report, and that's going to be much, much easier to set up technically once you have that result ID. So another thing you probably want to consider is just like how many source systems you have and where does that data currently live. And is it on a database already? So if all of your data and all that you care about is in Google Sheets currently, ID resolution, might make sense down the line. It doesn't mean that it's not going to solve a future problem, but it probably won't fit well into your existing infrastructure. And then finally, if there are processes that you want it to plug into, whether that's processes already running on the database, reporting processes that are happening totally outside of that, think through, how that's actually going to roll out. So an example is, say I have this report that is in Google Sheets, and even though I have this analytics database, those two are not connected. If I want my report to now be backed by ID res, that is going to take a little bit of work just to kind of plug those into each other. So that is my final slide. I kind of raced through that. I will turn it over to questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Anna. As you're going through your slides and talking about this reconciliation of data, one of the things that I think is highlighted here is data hygiene, right? So we've all seen examples where there's a date format, and in one system it's day, month, year. In another system it's month, day, year. In another system it starts with the year and does something else. Can you talk to how all of that is reconciled and addressed so that the system can be effective?
Yeah, so a lot of those things are going to be handled as part of some sort of implementation process. Part of Civis's solution does have kind of a UI for like mapping. I think there might be a types component, but in particular, you want to think about just like, what is the field called in mobile commons and what does that match to in Salesforce? Like that's not something that can automatically be known. So that does happen in large part in an implementation process. But once you have that lift of the implementation done, you're not really going to have to think about that again. And as someone who, sometimes is using ID res tables and is sometimes having to map source systems onto each other, it's a lot easier to have that really clean data output. And even though the lift isn't super high, to just do it as a one-off, like, once you aggregate that over however often people are doing this, it saves a lot of time.
Yeah. One question that's come in the chat is, how is IDR making decisions, for example, about which email, phone number, address for a person is the best or correct one? I think we've seen that. There's, Anna Mather, 2 different records. Everything's the same except 2 emails. Which one does it pick?
Yeah, so it's kind of a combination of things. There are some things that happen, probabilistically. Our team at Civis worked in a lot of ways over a couple years to build an algorithm that is good at predicting, what is like PII that we should trust relative to several different sources. At the same time, like there are cases where organizations are going to have their own unique way of determining that. So there is room to kind of plug in business rules within that to say that in a lot of cases, even though maybe my Salesforce email is more up to date or was given more recently, like for whatever reason, we think the Action Kit one is more reliable. So there is room to bring that kind of logic in.
Mm-hmm. And, I think that's really key, because in our next session will be about automation, but you hear that as a concern about machine learning even. When is the human intervention needed to make sure that what's being activated on is actually helpful in practice and not something that's happening from a technology standpoint that doesn't bear out? So, I'm curious, given we just have some time left, can you speak to maybe 1 or 2 examples that you've seen where IDR has been really impactful for a client?
Yeah, so I guess to first start with your like original, what you were mentioning about, there needs to be some human element and we can be skeptical about data. I think like as a practitioner, that's something that like I try to take to heart and be skeptical that data is not always going to be the perfect solution for every problem, but B, that you kind of have to like look at what's coming out, make sure it makes sense, and think about how your processes are fitting into each other, which is all a case for having people who are fluent in data and have time to think about these things in your organization. But moving on to your actual question. So one case I can think of is an organization that we work with. They have a built-out ID res solution. It's been built out for a couple of years now and is running weekly. So they've taken all of their sources, and like I talked about, they have this nice table at the end that just says, this is who we think is a single individual. These are all of their source IDs. When we went on to build a reporting project for them, it allowed us to, really quickly take data from a lot of different sources and resolve that into a single report about all of their donors. And, that report had just like a map view, so they could zoom in and see, at the congressional district level and all of these things, all of which are can be like sparsely populated in each individual data source, but kind of taken together. You can say with more confidence, that this represents something true about their underlying donor base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, just thinking about the application of this tool and the impact that it has, on the surface, it seems like, oh, it's really simple. But once it's actually integrated into a client, you can see the significant impact that it's having. We do have a new question in the chat, and that is, how does IDR account for individuals who have multiple email addresses and phone contacts?
Yeah, so that's, again, where that's happening like under the hood probabilistically. So I think that, and it's also something that the tech team that backs this is like always thinking about, small ways that it can be improved. It's going to take things like, what is the most recent, what I think there is some process to say like what is just like clearly not a real email or address. And if there are sources coming in from a few different places, you can say like, okay, it has the same email address in 2 of these and not the other one. That's probably going to be resolved as reliable. At the same time, it is going to give you some, you're going to get kind of like a confidence level out at the end. So depending on how conservative you want to be with selecting that PII, you can say like, on the more conservative side, I don't have a lot of confidence in, or like this is a really important application and we want to be sure. And if it's not, you can lower that confidence level and get what is probably the best.
Yeah, I think that's a really key component, in that there is that flexibility to design the confidence level, because having different clients and expectations for outcomes, it's important to be able to have that flexibility within the system.
Mm-hmm. And that could be kind of like an iterative thing where you try one thing and kind of look at the results and are like, nah. A lot of the data work I do is just, looking at the underlying data. Like, does this make sense? Is this in line with what I expect? Like, data is obviously going to tell you new things, but it should, if it's, something that's way out of left field, like you're going to have to do some thinking about like why that would have happened.
Yeah. And Anna, if I could just give a plug for you and your experience here at Civis. You started working in our client success team and now work within our applied data science team. And I think your unique perspective on client expectations and needs has been really helpful in your ability to understand how IDR is being implemented with our clients. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us here and answering questions from those in attendance.